Shadowbringers is it. Final Fantasy XIV steadily built up a positive reputation following its relaunch in 2013, but it wasn't until the release of Shadowbringers that the game's acclaim exploded to astronomical levels. The expansion would regularly top Game of the Year lists, but beyond that, a growing consensus began to consider Final Fantasy XIV the best Final Fantasy game ever. In a series full of some of the most well-regarded and revolutionary games of all time, the notion seems ridiculous. How could an expansion to an MMORPG be so good that it surpasses all-time classics like Final Fantasy IV, 6, or 7? Well, turns out that capitalizing on 6 years worth of narrative build-up, while simultaneously crafting a new setting that capitalizes on 32 years worth of franchise lore and iconography, can produce results that a Super Nintendo or PlayStation game simply never could. Shadowbringers is the culmination of everything that has come before it, answering long-held questions, revisiting forgotten concepts and characters, and polishing up what aspects of 14 that could still be pointed at to consider it an outlier to Final Fantasy's numbered series. It isn't without its faults, but nothing this ambitious ever could be. Stormblood was about war, and it told that story excellently, so it was curious that the bridge between it and Shadowbringers seemed to be building up to another war. Instead of being the focus of the next expansion, it served to be a tool to raise the stakes as all the Scions were pulled into a parallel world with no way home. The opening of Shadowbringers excellently sets the tone from the get-go. A sickly violet hue stains the vegetation in a petrified white forest, a color palette that's nearly inverted from the natural browns and greens of Eorzea. The player soon stumbles upon a friendly merchant, one that looks eerily similar to the man they met at the start of their adventure, all the way back in A Realm Reborn. Just as in that opening scene, the merchant offers them a drink and sends them on their way with a warning. Things are familiar, but that familiarity only breeds discomfort. It all comes to a head when an angelic monster attacks, dropping the ring that the merchant wore upon its defeat. The world is ill, and those who are still alive must hole up in fortified settlements. Welcome to the First. It's been known for a long time that the world the player has traversed thus far is but one of 14 similar worlds, but the exact mechanics behind those parallel worlds are now revealed. The player home is known as the Source, the most complete world the other 13 worlds are fragmented from. Shadowbringers takes place in the first of these fractured worlds, fittingly known as the First. The plight of the First was learned all the way back in the post-Heavensward patches, being the home of the Warriors of Darkness that they tried to save from an unending wave of light. Back then, Urianger and Minfilia were able to save the First, but only now are the effects of an imbalance between light and dark visible to the player. Minfilia's sacrifice was able to freeze the light, but only after much of the world perished. All that's left is the continent of Norvrant, a land that is very much Eorzea, but different. It's a curious move to place this expansion in an entirely new setting when so much time was spent fleshing out the world of the Source. There's a sense that what's to follow might simply be a side story to fill time before the next expansion ends the story, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Only by exploring this new realm do the truths of the setting become known, and the first figure to illuminate them is the Crystal Exarch. The Warrior of Light's primary concern at this point is finding their friends, so when the Crystal Exarch reveals himself as the one who summoned the Scions to the First, he is understandably met with hostility. He doesn't help his situation when he elaborates that the relationship of time between the Source and the First fluctuates, meaning that Thancred has actually been in the First for 5 years, Y'shtola and Urianger for 3, and Alphinaud and Alisaie for 1. Understandably, the player character's desire is to gather everyone and return home, but the Crystal Exarch dashes those hopes fairly quickly. The means of teleportation that left all the Scions as husks in the Source was an imperfect form of the magic. The Exarch was only able to transport their souls to the First, and in their incomplete state, using the same magic to return home could cause their souls to wash away in the Aetheric Sea. Essentially, the Scions are stuck here. They've been putting their time to good use, however, each of them scattering to the different lands of Norvrant to help the locals. The player sets out to make contact with each of their lost friends, starting with the twins Alphinaud and Alisaie. This begins the split quest line that's become customary with the beginning of each expansion. Unlike the comparable points in Heavensward and Stormblood, however, these quest lines assisting Alphinaud and Alisaie are among Shadowbringers' best. There's a potent sense of danger in each corner of Norvrant, thanks to the ever-present threat of the Sin Eaters. Sin Eaters are angelic monsters that appeared along with the Wave of Light, seeking to finish the job of purifying the First. What that essentially means is that they are mindless beasts whose only goal is to kill every last living being in the world. Alisaie's quests contain the most exposition on the Sin Eaters. She's been spending her year in the first in the desert of Amarang, the first parallel to Ul'dah in not only climate but geographic location. Her time in this dying world has only multiplied her desire for action, spending her days hunting Sin Eaters. Alisaie has always been more willing to show disdain than her brother, but the simmering anger behind her actions and words during this section do just as much to convey the danger the first is in as the desolate landscapes. When she isn't hunting Sin Eaters, she's helping a young woman named Tesseline care for the sick. The poor souls she cares for aren't suffering from any general affliction. They're in the early stages of Sin Eater transformation. Turns out that Sin Eaters aren't simply created by the light, they're the remains of those the light has consumed. Tesseline runs a small camp outside of Amarang's main city, where those who are destined to transform are given as pleasant final days as possible. The transformation is inevitable though, and when one is near the end of their affliction, they're taken away from the camp and dealt with before they turn. The slow turning posits Sin Eaters as a kind of zombie, but their angelic visage pushes them into a unique space for monsters where the only real comparison I could make is to another Square Enix series, Drakengard. The seemingly unending cycle of hunting Sin Eaters and caring for the soon-to-be Sin Eaters has left Alisaie nearly hopeless, attaching herself to Tesseline as the only positive thing in her world. She begins to hope ever so slightly when her old friend the Warrior of Light shows their face, a spot of hope that makes the end of the questline hurt even more. When a young boy who's about to turn goes missing from the camp, Tesseline rushes to go find him. Right as he is found, he's about to be taken away by a Sin Eater. Tesseline jumps in to rescue him, and what follows is the most harrowing scene in all of Final Fantasy XIV.
Mother,
If the tone shift to Shadowbringers wasn't clear enough yet, this scene clears that up right away. Just enough time is spent with Tesseline to make her stand out more than a generic quest giver, giving her loss a heavy impact. Seeing such a kind soul not simply be killed, but be corrupted in an instant, is entering disturbing territory that Final Fantasy XIV has only gestured towards before now. This is just one of many horrors the first has to offer, however, as Alphinaud's questline goes on to show the sorry state of the land of Kalusia. A large island off the coast of Norvrant, it's home to the luxurious city of Ul'Mor. A royal-colored conglomeration of towers, Ul'Mor is where the rich and privileged of Norvrant fled to in the wake of the flood. Merely seeing it linger on the horizon evokes feelings I hadn't yet felt in 14. Ul'Mor's architecture seems to be a throwback to the art of old Final Fantasy titles, striking a resemblance to the palace on Final Fantasy VI's cover in particular. It doesn't just stand out amongst the environment in Kalusia. Its larger-than-life design, bright colors, and rounded edges make Ul'Mor feel like a fairy tale in this already fantastical world. The inner workings of the city only enhance that effect. The rich live blissfully ignorant of the horrors outside the city walls, as retainers and helping hands handle all the hard work of cleaning, cooking, protecting, and entertaining the population. Just outside the city are shoddy shacks that house the poor, whose only motivation to keep living is to someday be allowed inside the city. Every once in a while, court jesters will visit the shanty town in search of someone with a skill set, such as painting or baking. Anyone who fits the description will be allowed in as a servant to one of Ul'Mor's rich families. The rest are kept complacent by a meager supply of meal, a bread-like food that the locals claim is the most delicious substance known to man. The poor are given just enough food, shown just enough a chance at prosperity, that they feel like they have no choice but to stay and play along. Their lot in life is horrid, but if they do as the elite say, they might be able to move up in life. Even if the chances of that are slim, the unknown of what might happen if they move keeps them in place. And if they rebel and fail, the elite will only punish them more. This fear-mongering and precise control of their poverty is how the elite keeps the poor in check. I'm sorry, I was supposed to be talking about a Final Fantasy game, wasn't I? There really aren't many things that feel more Final Fantasy than a town of insufferable rich people, doubly so if they are literally physically above where the poor people live. But Yulemoor isn't just a town for the elites, it's also home to one of Shadowbringers' central antagonists, Vothri. Further enhancing the fairy tale aura of Yulemoor, Vothri brings the metaphor of fat equaling wealth to its logical conclusion. Yulemoor's citizens worship the man, buying into his propaganda that the peace and prosperity they enjoy is only possible by his hand. Worship really is the correct word, as his status goes far beyond that of a beloved benefactor. When a young singer loses her ability to sing due to a polyp on her vocal cords, she worries she may be kicked out of the town. The man she works for finds out, but says he likes her far too much to simply get rid of her. She will instead be shown to Vothri and allowed to ascend, a privilege all of Yulemoor's citizens covet. The exact nature of this ascension is kept secret for much of Shadowbringers, but when it's learned later that the delicious meal is made of sin eaters, it doesn't take much to realize that anyone who loses their usefulness is first turned into a sin eater and then made into meal. Under Vothri's rule, the poor are allowed in as servants, and when their time is up, they're fed to the unknowing masses. When Alphino and the player confront Vothri for the first time, the way he's able to cultivate this society becomes clear. He has somehow established a diplomatic relationship with the Sin Eaters, simultaneously protecting Yulemoor from them while also making use of them as his personal army. The way he does this isn't revealed until much later, but it's clear that if the first is to be saved, he will have to be dealt with. All this story isn't necessary to know that Yulemoor's splendor is gained from sucking the life out of the rest of Kalusia. One must only look around to see that. The shacks that line the base of the Grand City are also found in several settlements scattered throughout the island. They're mirrored by the scant vegetation that pops up now and then amongst the dead grass and trees. Off the coast of the island is the Tempest, an ever-raging sea notorious for ending many a sailing vessel. Looming above it all is the same sickly bright sky that's plaguing all of Norvrant. Ever since the Flood of Light, the first has been in an eternal daytime. The clouded sky that might cast gray over the land instead shimmers with an unnatural yellow. Kalusia's dilapidated villages lit by an eerie sky kept bringing to mind the same place as I explored it. Majula, the hub area of Dark Souls 2. A more cynical person could extrapolate that Dark Souls comparison to more of Shadowbringers, perhaps the kind of person that would have compared Heavensward to Skyrim for its snowy landscapes, grand architecture, and dragon-focused plot. But any inspiration Square Enix may have taken from those other games were superficial, as the content of the first and Ishgard are full of unique ideas and locales. Take for instance my favorite site in all of Shadowbringers, the Wall of Light in Amarang. It's one thing to hear that the Flood of Light was stopped 100 years ago. It's another to see a massive wall of crystallized light proving it. Remnants of the fort that was halfway destroyed by the flood are scattered about the wall, sticking out at odd angles, capsulizing a moment in time. Not just an era, but an instant stopped mid-motion. A reminder that however dour the state of the first may be, it could have been so much worse. The second grandest site in Norvrant would have to be the Crystarium, the central hub of Shadowbringers. It's the most convincing metropolis the game has yet offered, featuring a wide-open courtyard, an upper canopy of stores, and underground refineries and libraries. One of the most impressive things about the Crystarium is that it's all one area, with no loading screens required to access its different wards. The central fixture is obviously the Crystal Tower, the very same tower that sprouted up in Eorzea, transported to the first by the Crystal Exarch when he arrived in the realm. Its impossible height is imposing, but thanks to its light blue hue, it's inviting and comforting at the same time, fitting a literal beacon of stability in a hostile world. Despite being such a late addition to the game, there's evidence that the plans for the Crystarium have been floating around since all the way back in 2005, with a tech demo from that year showing off a city that looks nearly identical in architecture and layout. It's yet another way the first feels like an alternate world, using a relic from a Final Fantasy XIV that could have been. The Crystarium is also the introduction to the peoples of the first. The races you would expect are present: humans, elves, cat people, the giant-like Rugaiden, though each are named differently in the first. There are also rabbit-like Viera and animalistic Hrothgar, two races that were added as options for player characters in this expansion. The small Lalafels are notably absent. Here, they're called dwarves, and are more akin to one of Eorzea's beast tribes, preferring to live among their own kind. An excellent divergence between the source and the first is the relations with those beast tribes. Whereas most of Eorzea sees them as uncivilized and lesser, the beast tribes are fairly integrated into Norvrant society. Amalja are one of the most common races in the Crystarium, and the kobolds are the majority population in Amarang's largest city. With the existential threat of the Light and the Sin Eaters looming overhead at all times, it only makes sense that the few peoples remaining in the first would be more diplomatic with each other. Just as it is for the remnants of the first, the Crystarium becomes the player's home for the duration of Shadowbringers. Helping Alphino and Alisaie with their troubles convinces them to return to the Crystarium and discuss how the first might actually be saved, instead of just defended. Here's where the structure of Shadowbringers is laid out. The never-ending day, and the Sin Eaters with it, are maintained by several extremely powerful Sin Eaters called the Light Wardens. If balance between light and dark is to return to the first, Light Wardens must be defeated. Each of Norvrant's regions are home to a different Light Warden, and coincidentally, a different Scion. The obvious course of action is to travel to each land of Norvrant, making contact with a lost ally and defeating a Light Warden. Shadowbringers structured its narrative in the same way A Realm Reborn did. Explore the continent, learn about its peoples, meet a Scion, kill a boss to save that area, move on to the next. The structure is much more effective here, however. You were told about the importance of dealing with primals in A Realm Reborn, but it wasn't exactly shown very effectively. It felt like little more than pest control, a narrative stopgap to ramp up to the Garleans making their move. Here, each Light Warden dealt with makes tangible progress to saving the first, and there's a clear end goal with a set amount of Light Wardens to deal with. The effect of killing a Light Warden isn't just felt in the narrative either. Defeating a region's Light Warden disperses the eternal light that drenches the land, bringing nighttime back to the world. The player can see that their actions are making a difference as the story progresses, something that's particularly unique in MMOs, where world states tend to stay the same so that players at different points in the story can occupy the same world with minimal discrepancies. The player isn't the only one to realize Shadowbringers' similarities to A Realm Reborn. The Warrior of Light of the First, whose real name is Ardbert, sees how what the player is doing lines up with the fruitless efforts of him and his allies. The First has experienced 100 years of hardship since Ardbert and his friends sacrificed themselves to stop the flood, but he remains as a ghost to watch the apocalypse he brought about unfold. Only the player can see him, a fact that shocks Ardbert. He's a constant presence throughout Shadowbringers, tending to show up at the end of each arc of the story to summarize how both he and the player character are feeling about their quest. Ardbert has 100 years of self-hatred in him, a fatalism that extends to his view of the player. To him, struggling against the Light Wardens can only bring about further disappointment and harm, at least until the first Light Warden is dispatched. As tangible progress is made, Ardbert struggles with the conflicting feelings that though his mistakes may not be as final as he once thought, he and his friends who fought so hard for their home won't be the ones to ultimately save it. He and his allies never sought glory in the first place. They were merely adventurers who stumbled into their roles as heroes. They're a stand-in for all the real-world players of Final Fantasy XIV, a relationship that's confirmed by the fact that they each use the original default designs for the game's jobs. It's as if they were part of a parallel version of the 1.0 release of 14, one whose realm never had the chance to be reborn. That is, until now. Ardbert realizes that, though the road was long and painful, he and his friends still played an instrumental part in the salvation of their home. Ardbert's allies did not share the same fate as him, however. Since the coming of the Sin Eaters, the bodies of the other Warriors of Light roam the land as Sin Eaters themselves. Hunting down these powerful husks is the objective of the role quests, a series of side quests that are both tangential and partially required. Ardbert had 4 companions, each falling into one of the game's job archetypes: a Black Mage caster DPS, a Bard more normal DPS, a White Mage healer, and a Paladin tank. To complete the corresponding questline, the player must play as the same archetype they are hunting. For example, any player that's playing a tank class will be allowed to complete the questline facing Brandon, the Paladin. These quests are fairly brief, and one quest unlocks every 2 levels, the intention being that the player will keep checking in on this story as they progress through the main quest. As a Red Mage, I completed the quest tied to the Black Mage Nilebert. The specifics aren't too notable, but seeing the lives of these lost warriors further accentuates the tragedy of their tale. I did find it amusing that Nilebert's quests strongly feature a grizzled warrior becoming attached to a child that has been placed in their care, a storyline I'd already experienced in both the Dark Knight and Red Mage quest lines. The highlight of the role quest would have to be the flashback in which you take control of your target, experiencing firsthand how similar this party was to the players of Final Fantasy XIV. The role quests never tie back into the main plot directly, but I'm glad completing one series of them is required, since humanizing the Lost Warriors of Light is definitely emotionally relevant to the story of Shadowbringers. The reason I was assigned Nilebert's quest is because I continue to play as a red mage, the same job I played in Stormblood. In an odd instance of serendipity, the darker tone of Shadowbringers brought along with it some harsh realities of playing Final Fantasy XIV. Just as I had done with previous expansions, I intended to play a new job, this time choosing the Gunbreaker. I spent a hearty 4-hour session leveling the class, which thankfully starts only 10 levels below the required level 70 for Shadowbringers. I was saddened to find that after my 4 hours, I had only gained a single level. There's two main reasons for this. The experience requirements to go from level 60 to 61 are over 1 million, an amount that would give 3 or 4 levels when trying to reach the level requirements for old expansions. The other factor is that, up to now, I was receiving a buff to my experience gain called the Road to 70. It doubled all experience I'd been receiving. Given its name, I assumed that leveling Gunbreaker from 60 to 70 would still let me enjoy the benefits of that buff. However, it turns out that the Road to 70 expires 90 days after the creation of your character, a threshold I had passed near the end of playing Stormblood. I might have persevered and leveled Gunbreaker anyway, but the longer grind put pressure on another negative aspect of 14 I had been able to ignore until now: the paid subscription. The game offers a generous free trial that includes the base game and Heavensward, but playing Stormblood and Shadowbringers requires not only a purchase of those expansions, but also a paid subscription. Each month of game time costs $15. Buying the game gave me a complimentary 30 days of game time, with another 15 given to me for reaching level 30. Not wanting to spend more money than I had to meant that I had a 45-day time limit to play all of both Stormblood and Shadowbringers, a task that I knew I could accomplish. But having a hard time limit meant that I didn't have the extra week available that I would now need to level Gunbreaker high enough to play Shadowbringers with it. All that to say, I am now a certified Red Mage main. There's one more reality check I would run into while playing Shadowbringers. Gear and loot are essential to an MMO, providing incentive to continually play content in hopes of getting the highest level gear, while also giving players options to express themselves visually. Playing catch-up through legacy content meant that I was essentially guaranteed to have good enough gear to get through all the main story quests. That changes when you're playing the current expansion of an MMO. Now, the best gear is still the best gear, not yet outclassed by newer content, and players are expected to grind for loot. That would be fine, except for the unfortunate reality that loot drops are, at least somewhat, randomized. I don't know how I managed to do it, but in all the dungeons and trials of Shadowbringers, I managed to get none of the high-level drops for my class. Normally, I wouldn't have noticed, but the first dungeon of the patch requires an item level of 430, an item level that I did not have. Once again, I was reminded of the ticking clock I was racing against. Realizing that I simply didn't have the time to run dungeons in hopes of getting the gear I needed, I knew I would have to use a shortcut: buying the best gear on the market. It was simple enough to do, but it cost all of the gold I had earned since Heavensward to do so. The item level requirement came as a shock, but I realized that by the time that dungeon was released, players had months to grind for the required loot, meaning that it's only really an issue if your goal is to beeline the main story. A reminder that most of the time, it's best to meet a game on its own terms rather than try to fit it to your own personal taste. Shadowbringers did add one consolation for players like me: the ultimate feature to please someone making a single-player review of the game: the trust system. With the trust system, players don't have to queue up for dungeons with other players. Instead, they can take a party of NPCs along with them from a pool of 6 characters. This is the final step to making Final Fantasy XIV feel on par with the rest of the number games in the series. A way to play the game entirely solo, bringing along a party of memorable characters that offer abilities that the players themselves are lacking. I was aware of the trust system's existence beforehand, but I didn't realize it was available from the very first dungeon in Shadowbringers. This is all I ever wanted from 14. A way to experience the gameplay highlights that the dungeons are, without the pressure and responsibility of playing with other people. Remember what I just said about it being better not to try to fit a game into your own personal taste? Unfortunately, the trust system is yet another example of that, bringing with it a number of issues that make it a worse option than playing with real people. Surprisingly, The issues aren't what I would have assumed might stem from playing with a group of AI. The AI is programmed for each dungeon, so they will always carry out mechanics and dodge attacks correctly. The healer will do what they can to keep you alive, the tank will get enemies' attention and keep them facing away from the group. The issue isn't that the AI is incompetent, like so many AI companions in other games. The issue with the trust system is that running a dungeon with it makes the experience take much, much longer. Dungeons that might take 20 minutes with a party of real players could now take 30 to 40 minutes with the trust system. This is because, for some reason, the AI has a difficult time putting out damage, favoring single target damage over area of effect attacks, and just generally not attacking optimally against bosses. Every monster takes considerably longer to kill, with some mobs feeling as long as a boss in a normal dungeon run. Clearing mobs between the mini-bosses in a dungeon has always felt a little like a chore, but seeing how quickly a group could clear each area kept up the excitement between boss encounters. With the slow and steady damage output of the AI, each encounter will take relatively the same amount of time. Too long. The problem extends to boss fights, though the fact that the AI knows the mechanics does provide the player easy learning of each fight by watching their companions. The most infuriating part of the trust system, though, and the one that can really spike the amount of time a dungeon can take to complete, is the fact that if you happen to die, it's an instant party wipe. I can understand this on some level. It wouldn't be fun to lie there and watch the gameplay itself for a while, and playing with the trust system turns a dungeon into a single-player experience, so it makes some sense to punish the player for making a mistake. But if I have a healer who's perfectly capable of reviving me, why don't I have the choice to wait for that? At this stage of the game, boss mechanics are becoming more complex, and attacks that kill in a single hit if not correctly reacted to are more common. Forcing the player to walk through an entire third of the dungeon to reach the boss again is pointless when their other players aren't still actively fighting the boss. Add in the low damage output of the AI, and it's very easy to be fighting a boss for 7 minutes, only to die at the last phase and have to restart the fight from the beginning. These problems compound with each other to make the trust system the biggest disappointment I have had in my whole Final Fantasy XIV experience. A feature that seemed tailor-made for someone like me that oftentimes felt like I was being chastised for how I wanted to play. Despite my disappointment, the trust system isn't without merit. There's always been a bit of a narrative disconnect between the context and gameplay of the dungeons, with groups of random adventurers joining the hero on the most dangerous missions instead of the many capable fighters they've befriended. This disconnect is at its strongest in Shadowbringers, since a few Eorzeans in the first were brought there through very specific means, and Norvrand doesn't have too many adventurers wandering around. The trust system finally gets around this, by taking the obvious route of letting the characters participate in dungeons, though the disconnect is still seen in the 8-player trials that aren't compatible with the trust system. It can also be a massive help to anyone playing a DPS class. Sure, the trust system may make the dungeon 15 minutes longer, but when it forgoes the sometimes 20-minute wait times DPS players can have to find a group, it wastes less time overall. That reason alone was enough to make me use the trust system for all but one of Shadowbringers' dungeons. There's one more problem I had with the trust system, though this one was less tangible. Around my third dungeon, while I was mindlessly performing my rotation on another mob, I began to feel lonely. I missed the other players. I never talked to them in chat, I barely even emoted, but that knowledge that I was taking on these monsters with real people gave a sense of camaraderie that I didn't even know was there until it wasn't. After 200 hours of trying my hardest to play Final Fantasy XIV like any other single-player game, I realized that what I had grown to love about it was the fact that it wasn't a single-player game. Being immersed in a fake world full of real people, sharing my victories with real people, those are the things that make 14 stand out in my mind. That would be a lovely sentiment to end this video series on, but I haven't even gotten around to discussing the characters that are part of the trust system. After Alphino and Alice, the first scion the player reconnects with is Thancred. If his time wandering after the bloody banquet in A Realm Reborn hadn't already, 5 years in the first have hardened Thancred. He still tosses out the occasional quip, but it's usually a bit of sarcasm to express how displeased he is with things. The bandana covering his eye might have been a bit too on the nose for a brooding man filled with regrets, so he, as well as all the scions, get a redesign for Shadowbringers. Thancred's new look is much more well put together, a sign that nothing is more important to him than his responsibilities. Still, The white trench coat and gunblade give him that edgy flair we've come to expect from him. The gunblade in particular is something to note. Thancred has given up his old fighting style as a ninja, now becoming a gunbreaker. This is a touch I really appreciated, because it makes sense that he would use his time in the first to learn a new skill. Urianger has done the same, moving from his former job of scholar to the much more fanciful astrologian. There's a mechanical reason behind these changes as well. The trust system would be lacking varied tank and healer options if they remained as their former jobs, but it's a nice case of story and gameplay justifications arising simultaneously. Thancred's change to Gunbreaker especially feels organic, as it represents a shift in his mentality from a lone wolf to a protector. The person he's protecting is a young girl named Minfilia. Not to be confused with the other Minfilia, the scion whose sacrifice saved the first from annihilation, but also to be confused with that Minfilia, since that name has become a title passed down to several young girls in the 100 years since the Flood. The physical similarities are undeniable, sharing the same bright blonde hair and blue, pupilless eyes. Minfilia's power has been given to these young girls, who are protected and trained to be warriors until they can lead an uprising against the Sin Eaters. Unfortunately, each Minfilia has met the same fate, dying on the battlefield in their teens. This Minfilia is different, being captured and held in Yulmar her whole life to prevent her from causing another uprising. Thancred broke her out of her prison and has been caring for her ever since. While it would be within reason that a scion would want to free a young girl, especially one who inherited the power of an old friend, Thancred's attachment runs deeper. The original Minfilia is the person Thancred cared for above all else, and he has never forgiven himself for failing to protect her. He's clearly projecting his past onto this young girl, one who is inherently tied to Minfilia, but is still her own person. This is a point that the original Minfilia makes to him, using the new Minfilia as a vessel to talk to Thancred one last time. She states her desire for these young girls to be their own people, regretting that they're burdened with the expectation to be a hero of some kind. The young Minfilia knows this, but the coldness Thancred exudes causes her to believe that the only way she can be worthwhile is by succeeding Minfilia anyway. Her struggle to live up to her predecessor is actually quite similar to how the original Minfilia always beat herself up for not leading the Scions as well as Louisoix did. After Thancred is able to admit that he cares for the young Minfilia not because of who she should be, but who she is, she's able to fully become her own person. Her hair changes color, and her eyes become less cloudy as she adopts the name Reen, choosing to continue to fight for Norvrand of her own volition rather than due to a sense of duty. Whereas Thancred spent his years in the first developing his skills and coming to terms with his hang-ups, Y'shtola doubled down on much of her eccentric traits. She cut off all contact with the Crystal Exarch as soon as she arrived, furious with him for transporting everyone to the First in the middle of a crisis in the Source. Since then, she's hid herself in a small village in the woods, becoming something of a matriarch to a small clan that lives there. The Rak'tika Greatwoods that she resides in are home to ruins of Norvrand's ancient civilization, and Y'shtola has spent much of her time in the First studying them in hopes of finding information on the realm's current troubles. When the party first arrives in the Greatwoods, my suspicions that Y'shtola lost her sight in Heavensward were confirmed. She retains some of her vision, but it's only limited to seeing ether, meaning that while her combat capabilities aren't impaired, she can't take in the world as she once did. She greets the player with an unexpected hostility, not recognizing their ether. Each time the player defeats a Light Warden, they absorb all the light that they were holding. This leaves their ether resembling that of a Sin Eater. An explanation causes Y'shtola to realize that the Warrior of Light really has been transported to the First like the others, but the foreign nature of their ether causes her to be suspicious of the player for much of Shadowbringers. Her suspicions manifest as a demeanor even colder than the one she had before, dropping more than a few callous remarks that genuinely hurt her old friends. This is contrasted by a warm relationship she shares with the clan she's joined, with one member in particular showing hints of a romance between them. Once the Light Warden of the Greatwood is dealt with, she starts to adjust her attitude to be more friendly, finally accepting that whatever issue the player's ether might be having is not of their own choosing, and resolving to find a solution. Urianger is the final missing scion, though other than his new job, he remains his same old self. He's taken up residence in the land of Ilmeg, home of the Pixies. It's the closest to storybook fantasy the game has come by a wide margin, littered with flowers and rainbows, and the mischievous pixies who call it home want nothing more than to play for all eternity. Having the permanently serious Urianger call a place like this home in the First is an amusing juxtaposition, though not amusing enough to smooth over the fact that this section might be the expansion's weakest. The nature of the Pixies means that winning them over involves several annoying quests gathering herbs and solving riddles, a section annoying enough to be reminiscent of the infamous Moogles of Heavensward. It's also perhaps the most inconsequential leg of the journey, as the pixies only factor into the story 1 or 2 more times upon leaving the area, and it features little plot or character development. Ilmeg would be the low point of Shadowbringers if it wasn't for the return trip to Amarang, where the plot is put on hold for a bit so the player can help rebuild a railroad. If that sounds like an arbitrary roadblock, it is. Fixing the rail lets the group past a single door, only for the cart to be destroyed once again, forcing them to go the rest of the way on foot. Most egregiously, it features what is easily the worst dungeon since Heavensward, Malika's Well. It barely advances the plot, being a journey to gather one part needed to finish repairs on the rail, while also having the least interesting theming and visuals since the base game. Malika's Well is a mine, one of the top 3 most cliched dungeon themes in all of fantasy, and one that 14 has already done multiple times. The one saving grace of this section is it's the climax to the Thancred and Reen storyline, giving some solid character development to carry the player through. My complaints with the trust system and highlighting Malika's Well might make it seem that Shadowbringers is a step back in the gameplay department, but I want to correct that assumption now. Shadowbringers has some of the best dungeons and trials to date. An early example of this would be at the end of the Ilmeg section, fighting the second Light Warden Titania. It's an amalgamation of aspects that were standouts in previous fights, with a timed meter to fight against, a terrain shift halfway through the fight, and unique positional mechanics, all punched up by a palpable atmosphere. Admittedly, most of the best dungeons and trials are saved for the back half of the expansion, but that means that once you're past Malika's Well, every single dungeon and boss to follow are among the best in the whole game. Dungeons have always felt somewhat similar to an amusement park ride, specifically a Disneyland ride. Disney puts a lot of effort into making the wait for the ride part of the experience, building areas filled with details and distractions to make the guests feel like they've stepped into another world, hinting at the existence of more outside the narrow halls that they're forced to wait in. 14's dungeons have the same design ethos. Cover up the fact that each dungeon is a straight hallway with varied encounters and art design to suggest that there's more to the area beyond what the player gets to explore, punctuated by the boss that would be the actual ride in this comparison. The Grand Cosmos is an excellent example of this, since it seems especially Disney-inspired. Players battle through a colorful castle filled with ghosts of old noblemen, haunted suits of armor, magic paintings that warriors jump out of, and a massive, picturesque garden. The castle's exterior is even reminiscent of It's a Small World. The magnificent sights of the Grand Cosmos expertly convey a fully realized space, even if the player can only explore one designated route through it. Gameplay outside of dungeons also carries over Stormblood's effort to make the game fun at all times with some excellent single-player instances. While there aren't many new types of missions, the various modes of gameplay Stormblood added are retained and iterated on. The standout would be the quest exploring the temple in the Raktika Greatwood. Here, the game does its best Indiana Jones impression, with a stealth section, puzzles involving small idols, and even a sequence where you run away from massive boulders. There are also a number of full-scale battles with complex choreography. Characters jump in and out of the fight, scripted set pieces are scattered throughout, and an intimidating recurring boss regularly makes his presence known. After the first Light Warden is dealt with, Vothru realizes his accord with the Sin Eaters might be in jeopardy, and sends out Yulmor's army to stop the Scions and the Crystarians' forces from making any more progress towards saving the world. The leader of these forces is General Ranjit, a martial arts master who's more than capable of defeating any Scion in a head-to-head fight. In the past, he was the man who trained and cared for the young Benfilias. After losing so many students and seeing humanity's hope dashed again and again, Ranjit resigned himself to the idea that the world would never improve. He became loyal to Vothri, seeing his absolute rule and accord with the Sin Eaters as the only way that humanity could see a kind of peace ever again. Being the third or fourth enemy general the player has fought in Final Fantasy XIV, it's hard to make much of an impression, but his ruthless no-nonsense persona paired with his unique fighting style carves out a niche for him amongst the game's rogues gallery. Ranjit isn't the primary antagonist of Shadowbringers though. Vothri isn't either. Shadowbringers' main villain, the main villain of all of Final Fantasy XIV to this point, is the one and only Emet-Selch. The rest of this video might as well have been a prologue to get here, as Emet-Selch is not only the best character in 14, he might be my favorite character in any Final Fantasy game. He was once known as Solus Saskalthus, founder of the Garlean Empire. Before that, he founded the ancient kingdom of Allag, and before that, he was one of the 14 members of the Ascian Council, the group that led Ascian society. But now, Emet-Selch is your friend. Like the other Ascians, his goal is to bring about the rejoining, a process by which the 14 shattered realms will fold back into the source and make the world whole again. In order to accomplish this, each realm must be destroyed in a calamity charged with one of the elements, be that fire, water, or even light. Once destroyed, the realm will collapse into the source, causing a devastating natural disaster. 7 refracted worlds have been destroyed already, and their rejoining are what caused the 7 umbral calamities the source has endured. Saving the first from the light threw off Emet-Selch's plans, so why not? He wants to see if the Scions can turn things around. He'll even help out a bit. Obviously, the Scions don't trust him, but what are they going to do? They could hardly fight him, and even if they did manage to beat him, they'd need a specific device to prevent him from simply coming back to life. Knowing this, the Scions begrudgingly tolerate his company. Knowing all the harm he's done, knowing all the death he's trying to cause, how could anyone possibly stomach Emet-Selch? Easily. He's just a cool guy. The coolest guy, even. Emet-Selch oozes charisma. Half of the things he says are dripping with so much sarcasm that the room becomes humid. He couldn't care less what the Scions think of him. He's gonna stick around because it's fun. When it stops being fun, he'll leave in the middle of someone talking, giving a half-hearted wave as he walks away. He simply does not care. He thinks he's the only person in the room that matters, and when he's around, it's hard to argue with that. Yet as the story continues, you start believing it when he says he's actually trying to help. What would a man so sure of himself gain from lying? It's more than simple likability that makes Emet-Selch such an excellent character. It's the truths and revelations of the history of the Ascians, and the setting of Final Fantasy XIV as a whole that makes it understandable to root for him. The Ascians have long claimed that they're superior to all other life, but there's actually some truth to that. The Ascians are the people from before the world was split into 14. Their society was beyond anything the world has seen since, a utopia filled with eternal beings. Ascians are capable of near limitless creation magic. As long as the idea of an item is there, Ascians are able to use ether to create it. Conceptually, it's quite similar to Plato's theory of forms, an idea that suggests that objects in the world are merely imitations of a perfect form of that object. The rampant use of ether proved to have some unintended side effects, though. An unprecedented calamity dawned upon the Ascian homeworld, an event that came to be known as the Final Days. To combat this, the Ascians worked together to create a manifestation of the planet's will, known as Zodiark. Zodiark did manage to prevent the Final Days, but the devotion to him developed by many Ascians caused a rival faction to think Zodiark needed a counterpart to keep him in check. Thus, they created Hydaelyn, whose power was to have anything she struck. The two ultimately clashed, with Hydaelyn striking Zodiark enough times to split him into 14 shards. This is the truth behind the shattering of the worlds, and the truth behind Zodiark and Hydaelyn. They are the original primals. Not only does this recontextualize the morality of Zodiark and Hydaelyn, it also recontextualizes the relationship between the Scions and Hydaelyn. If she's just a primal, could she really be the ultimate force of good? Is the Echo just a sign that you've become Hydaelyn's thrall, just as the Beast tribes have become brainwashed by their primals? The creation magic of the Ascians was passed down to the new races of the Shattered Worlds, giving them the power to summon primals of their own. Since primals absorb so much ether in their creation, they're an instrumental part of the Ascians' plans to cause cataclysms and bring about the rejoining. Emet-Selch is at the forefront of all these plans and machinations. He quite literally engineered most every conflict in Final Fantasy XIV, all in the name of the rejoining. What seemed for so long to be a generic evil plan to end the world is something far more tragic. The Ascians simply want to save their home, their friends, their families. They have lived countless centuries with the burden of their losses, seeing weak imitations of themselves come to life in hollow worlds that pale in comparison to the one they knew. How could the Ascians see the humans, elves, and others as equals, when in their own lifetimes they have walked alongside vastly greater beings? The Scions see the death and destructions the Ascians have caused and consider them monsters, but as Emet-Selch himself so eloquently puts it, yes, mortal relativism and all that. Case in point, I do not consider you to be truly alive. Ergo, I will not be guilty of murder if I kill you. Does Emet-Selch truly believe that, though? Well, yes, but as the Scions defeat each Light Warden one by one, he starts to second-guess that notion. The Scions are humanity's last chance to prove themselves to Emet-Selch. He underestimated their abilities, and if he was wrong about them, maybe he was wrong about all the new races. It truly comes across as though he's rooting for them. That is, until they failed just as he predicted they would. The Scions do manage to defeat every Light Warden, the final of which being Vothri himself, but the light absorbed by the player character proves to be too much. They begin to lose themselves, and the light begins to spread throughout Norvrant once again. Emet-Selch would be hurt by this turn of events if it didn't disgust him so much. Knowing that he was right all along about the inferiority of the new races, he kicks a new plan into motion to destroy the first and continue his march toward the rejoining. Selch retreats beneath the ocean, amidst flooded remnants of the Ascian homeworld. Not satisfied with mere ruins, he uses magic to recreate his lost home city of Amaurot. Amaurot is unlike anything else in the entire game. A modern metropolis with streetlights and skyscrapers decked out in Art Deco interiors. I won't lie, the sight of such a city at the bottom of the ocean is eerily similar to BioShock, and the choice of architecture and art style don't make the similarities any less noticeable. Regardless, it's a potent visual that communicates both how far beyond Eorzea the Ascians were, and how completely forgotten the city has become. Shades of lost Ascians dot the streets and buildings, playing at a moment in time like a tape recording. It is simultaneously a loving recreation of the city and a hollow imitation. A direct manifestation of the fact that, though this is all Emet-Selch has been thinking about, the passage of unfathomable years has eaten away at the details. I'd like to take a moment to pay the highest compliments to Final Fantasy XIV's composer, Masayoshi Soken. Thanks to him, 14 has had an excellent soundtrack since its disastrous 1.0 release, but his work in Shadowbringers is on a whole other level. Music has always been one of my favorite aspects of video games, so it's not lightly that I say Shadowbringers has become one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. There are so many songs I could talk about, from the rocking battle theme, to the internet's favorite A Long Fall, or maybe To the Edge with its heartbreaking backstory. But I want to highlight Shadows Withal, the theme to a dungeon that takes place in Amaurot. It's my favorite example of Soken's ability to not only write a good song, but to tailor the song so expertly to a specific part of the game. The tuning radio at the start of the song sounds like echoes of a dead Amaurot, while the sound of a radio at all reminds the listener of a time long gone. At the same time, it sounds deeply futuristic for 14's setting, reminding that Amaurot is so far beyond the technology of Eorzea and Norvrant. The jazz that follows maintains the same dual effect, feeling retro and futuristic at once, while also being the perfect accompaniment to the Art Deco interior. There are so many examples of touches like this, and a number of compositions that attempt things I've genuinely never heard before. Just as 14 has proved worthy to stand next to the greatest of Final Fantasy games, Soken absolutely deserves to be discussed alongside the great Nobuo Uematsu. When the Scions confront Emet-Selch, he only expresses disappointment. Reen and Y'shtola were able to prevent the light from completely taking over the player character, and Selch was hoping to see them turn into a new Light Warden. He's lost all interest in the Scions and anyone else of the new races. If the Scions want to defeat him, they'll have to survive the final days, fighting beasts and witnessing the meteor storm that pelted the planet accompanied by Selch's narration. From a narrative and visual standpoint, this is perhaps the best dungeon Shadowbringers has to offer. It culminates in Emet-Selch finally joining the fight himself, easily dispatching all of the Scions until he is interrupted by the Crystal Exarch. With his hood down, we learn that the Crystal Exarch is Grahatia, the old friend who sealed himself in the Crystal Tower back in A Realm Reborn. Who could have guessed such a revelation, that the only man who could possibly be tied to the tower was actually the one who was tied to the tower? He at least puts his powers to good use, spontaneously summoning 7 other warriors of light from other worlds to help defeat Emet-Selch in a moment that gives some appreciated justification to the fact you're about to fight the final boss with 7 random players. Selch takes on the form of Hades, and the final confrontation begins. A fight that decides nothing less than the fate of the universe, a battle of pure will for whose people deserve the right to continue living. When the heroes inevitably win, thanks to a final helping hand from Ardbert, Emet-Selch isn't angry. He accepts his defeat, simply requesting that he and the Ascians be remembered. His only goal was to see his people and his world live on, even at the end, realizing that the only way they can is in memories. Night is restored to Norvrant, the Sin Eaters are defeated, and the Ascian behind it all has faded away. Ardbert can finally find peace, knowing that he didn't doom his home. Things are wrapped up nicely for Norvrant. Right about the time the player remembers they're actually from the Source, and there's a war happening there, and their friends are stuck in the First. The post-game patches, as usual, tie up these loose ends. A good deal of time is spent finding a way to safely return everyone to the Source, but all that really matters is that they're eventually able to. Not before one final crisis in the First, however. As the world is healing, Ardbert returns in a physical form, spreading hope across the land and inspiring a new generation of Warriors of Light. Since this course of action goes against pretty much everything Ardbert came to realize after death, the Scions quickly pick up on the fact that this person isn't truly Ardbert. In reality, it's the last remaining original Ascian, Elidibus. He hasn't given up on the rejoining. In fact, with Emet-Selch gone, Elidibus' own plan can come to the forefront. He needs Warriors of Light to rise up and destroy the darkness so that the First can once again become unbalanced. To do this, he creates an image of the final days over the Crystarium. He explains that this is what causes the echo. Hydaelyn has no chosen. She's always calling out. It's the image of the destruction of the Ascian society that wakes a latent memory in people, causing them to hear Hydaelyn's cries. The summoning of Bahamut at the end of 14's original release was another such event, with the sight of meteors falling from the sky triggering the echo in a new generation of adventurers, the players of Final Fantasy XIV. To stop Elidibus, more must be learned about him, and I must continue to explain story and lore with little input of my own. Elidibus isn't his true name, and Emet-Selch wasn't his real name either. They were titles given to members of the Ascian Council, each name being a specific role, like President or Treasurer or that kind of thing. When the Ascians created Zodiark, Elidibus sacrificed himself to act as the Primal's core. Due to a combination of being part of a Primal, obsession with the responsibilities of his office, and time passing, Elidibus is even more single-minded than Emet-Selch. The only thing he knows is to foster false heroes and bring about the rejoining. The memory of why he's doing this has nearly faded. The people and sights of Amaurot scrubbed from his mind by the years of single-minded obsession. When Norvrant's new Warriors of Light don't get the job done, Elidibus summons shades of Warriors of Light from all of the Shattered Worlds, leading to a dungeon called the Hero's Gauntlet. The Hero's Gauntlet is the best dungeon in Final Fantasy XIV, not just Shadowbringers. The player has to fight images of what they were at the start of their journey, myriad warriors encompassing all the jobs a player might choose to play as, whose only goal is to stop the bad guy. The dungeon spans the whole continent of Norvrant, starting in Amarang, passing through Ilmeg, and ending in Lankland. The accompanying music ties together the themes of each land as well, a medley that flows back and forth through melodies, amounting to a song that could be seen as the theme of Norvrant itself. The cherry on top of all of this is the fact that the NPCs the player has befriended throughout their journey help along the way. Amarang's mining communities offer stone golems to fight alongside, and Ilmig's pixies pull out some tricks to help out. I can't imagine how any dungeon that comes after could one-up the Hero's Gauntlet. It's the ultimate culmination of Shadowbringers. The only thing that could trump that would be something that feels like the culmination of all of Final Fantasy. Anyway, the final confrontation with Elidibus is the culmination of all of Final Fantasy, as he takes the form of the Warrior of Light. Not a Warrior of Light, the Warrior of Light. The original warrior from Final Fantasy I. This fight isn't just against Elidibus, it's against the concept of a hero that the series was built on. Defeating this is conquering the myth of the Warrior of Light, an admittance that true heroes aren't brave warriors that seek glory, but people who are able to rise up against the odds to save who and what they care about. It's a tough battle with multiple phases. The warrior's ultimate attack is a level 4 limit break, a mechanic normally reserved for the player, whose own limit break caps at level 3. This final fight pushed Final Fantasy XIV to the edge of what it's capable of doing mechanically, visually, and emotionally. Elidibus thinks he's won when he banishes the players to the Shadow Realm, but his fate is sealed when an anonymous Ascian arrives and warps the party back. A sarcastic, half-hearted wave as he's leaving is our only hint to the Ascian's identity. Elidibus is defeated, finally relegating the Ascians and their home to the memories of the player. Norvrant is saved once again, as the Scions are finally able to return home to the source. The Ascian threat as a whole is no more, the rejoining they have fought for since A Realm Reborn halted once and for all. The city-states of Eorzea are trying to enter diplomatic relationship with the Beast Tribes, and the war with the Garleans has come to a sudden halt. It feels like all the threads Final Fantasy XIV has been spinning since its relaunch have finally been resolved. A beautiful, satisfying ending for a one-of-a-kind wonder of the gaming world. XIV's player base is only growing though, and Shadowbringers caused the horde of even more people to play. It just wouldn't make financial sense to end the story here at the height of the game's popularity. The show must go on. So, it turns out that Xenos is still alive, and was able to take back his body after Elidibus abandoned it. He kills his father, the current emperor, and takes control of the Garlean Empire. I won't lie, the grand threats experienced in the first made the return to the source and its comparably petty squabbles feel hollow. I just defeated the looming threat that's been in the background of this whole game and stopped an apocalypse. And now I'm supposed to go back to a simple war? I love Xenos as a villain in Stormblood, where his simplicity worked in his favor, but it's really hard to go from one of the most compelling villains in gaming back down to a man who likes to fight and kill things. Luckily, the developers seemed to know that this wouldn't be enough of a hook and introduce a new villain, the Ascian Fandaniel. It turns out there are more Ascians, one created by the originals after the world was shattered. As such, they have no inherent attachment to Amarat, and with the city survivors now all gone, these lower-ranked Ascians can carry out their own desires. Fandaniel is clearly an effort to create a villain as charismatic as him itself, but without the emotional core. His theatrics are all in service of his only goals: chaos and destruction. The why is unclear as of now, but Fandaniel's plan is to recreate the final days and destroy the source, and all the other realms along with it. Perhaps not the most interesting motivation, but it is at least a raise in stakes. As a last gesture of goodwill to the players from the dev team, almost as if they're saying, "Trust us, this will be good," the final patch ends with an incredible single-player mission. The player takes control of multiple characters, forming multiple parties, as each squad fights a different boss across a large battlefield. The player swaps back and forth between their own character and other Scions as they tackle new types of fights and mechanics. It's exhilarating, and the hesitations I had about continuing the story washed away by the end of it. The next expansion, Endwalker, will focus on this conflict in what Square Enix claims will be the conclusion to the Hydaelyn and Zodiark saga. I wonder if this finale could be better than the one Shadowbringers offered, but with how incredible Shadowbringers is, I trust the dev team completely. I've spent most of this year playing through this game, a game that had to fight an uphill battle against my own biases and preferences to meet my expectations. It's fitting, because at its core, Final Fantasy XIV is about fulfilling expectations. Minfilia taking over for Louisoix, Reen stepping into the role of Minfilia, Thancred taking over for the father he robbed Minfilia of, Estinian embodying the title of Azure Dragoon, Lys fulfilling what was expected of her sister, Y'shtola becoming the witch Matoya trained her to be, Elidibus being blindly determined to uphold his role, the player character fulfilling the role of the fabled warrior of light. That consistent thread of meeting expectations can only be at the core of this game because Final Fantasy XIV itself so utterly failed to meet expectations when it launched. The stories of these characters growing into the roles they were destined for is such a clear parallel to the story of the game's creation. Whether you look at the characters of Final Fantasy XIV or the game itself, the message is clear. The failures of the past must be remembered, as they're the only reason greatness can be achieved in the present. I hope you enjoyed the video. This one is twice as long as any other I've made, so I hope I was able to justify that length. This is the end of my series on Final Fantasy XIV, though I do hope to make one more video on Endwalker when it releases. 14 is a special game, and I'm glad I was able to share my thoughts with anyone who stuck with me throughout the videos. Thanks for watching.